People. Thank you. I think we have a seven. That I think includes me. One, two, three, four, five. Any case, I see Mary from Knoxville. I don't know anybody else is going to come from there. But in any case, welcome. I've been, as I do living up here, been doing some thinking lately. And one of the things that I think about is Jesus Christ and all this time that he took to be by himself. You know, they talk about the first 30 years and or whatever it was, and why didn't he go public? And a couple of things come to my mind, especially as we're going to be talking about the God of power, is in my tradition, we believe that Jesus, who was born at a certain point in time, was the Christ, who was not born, but is one with God, is God. So when Jesus came into the world, because he had this unique connection to the divine, he knew what it was to be close to God, to be what is often called now non-duality. And so there were two things. One is he longed for the solitude that allowed him simply to enjoy that divine presence that was within him. He didn't want to get too busy. He didn't want to travel around. And the second thing is that being God, this was, as far as we know, this is the first time that God actually became human. And so I think that God wanted to enjoy just experiencing being human. He found it so wonderful. Now, remember, he didn't have indoor plumbing. He didn't have electricity. He didn't have indoor heating. So it's not as if, oh man, he was living in a mansion and he just wanted to wallow in it. Yeah, it was a tough life in many ways. For us moderns, Westerners, we would be whining. Well, I'll only speak for myself. I would be whining about how terrible things are. Why don't I have indoor plumbing and blah, blah, blah. And what I forget is, isn't it beautiful to be part of God's creation, to be this human being that has evolved over billions of years of this universe circling around doing its thing. And so God had created this universe, he had created this world and just wanted to enjoy it. For all we know, Jesus just wanted to enjoy cockroaches. I don't know, but he just wanted to enjoy being in this body. And so I think that's a couple of reasons that we might keep in mind. Some people say, well, it took him 30 years to figure out what he was going to do. Well, maybe he kind of knew what he was going to do. But before he did what he did, he wanted to do these kinds of things. And in that evolving, as when Jesus came into public, he would refer to God as Father. So I think so I'll take Jesus, but all of us in this sense, when we come out of the womb as an infant and a little baby, as we're told by, I guess, psychologists of babies, the whole world is one. Everything's one. The baby doesn't have a sense of I'm separate baby and here's the breast. It's just all one. So we kind of come into this world with a whole sense of non-duality, whole sense of oneness. And I think that the solitude that we seek later, Jesus as well, since he's truly human, was wanting to, have that. uh, sense of unity, because so there is an kind of an early sense of the divine as feminine, as God as mother, because that's the earliest experience that we have, this non-duality, God as mother. Now, then of course we get into what they call the terrible twos, and we'll get to Berdayev, who talks very much about the individuality and personality and things like that. So as we begin to, terrible twos, they tell us. I've been a more perfect person. I'm sure I didn't have terrible twos, but my sisters did. They were whatever. Any case, so here we are trying to become an individual, a separate person, to break away. And it's suggested by some transpersonal psychologists that, and I like this idea, if there's a father in the house, if the married couple, and if there's a father in the house, you see this father who loves the mother and yet goes away and then comes home at the end of the day, like farmer goes out in the field. I don't know. But in any case, there's this sense of this other way of being. And so the child, it wants to develop this sense of a separate self. I guess it's part of our naturalness. And as we develop this separate self, keeping with this psychological way of looking, and begin to grow as a separate individual, we sort of reimagine or discover or intuit God as Father. But what happens when we see God as Father is we see God as separate. I know as a little kid, God was out there in heaven. God was not my mother and her breast. God was out there in heaven and was a powerful guy. And if you mess with him, he was going to get you. And this father figure of God is part of our developing our separate self and becoming a individual. But so I think of Jesus as an adult speaking about God as Father, but at the same time, he often in the scriptures went away or stepped away in the middle of the night to be by himself, not doing anything, not making things happen, and I think it was a return to God, the Mother. The more non-dualistic part, and this is the struggle that all of us have. I think to be an individual, separate self, but not a selfish separate self, and to have a sense of our own individuality and a sense of our community. So to have both the male and the female, if you will. Aspects of ourselves. So those are things I'm thinking about. We were just reading something today about Jesus. The people are bringing little children to Jesus. Now, this is probably in Galilee, the area where he grew up and people kind of knew him. And what had happened is they had a sense, parents, say mothers, especially their little children. So dad's probably off doing his thing. So the mother feels Jesus is a comfortable person to be around. He's in touch with himself, with his full humanity, if you will. And they think that it's safe to have him around their little children. They want Jesus to touch the children. They're not looking for healing. The children aren't sick. They just feel if their child can be close to Jesus, maybe their child might pick something up that's going to be good in their development. Well, at the end of this, Jesus says, yeah, let little children come to me. This is what the kingdom of heaven is about. Developmental spirituality, duh. But at the end of that, it says a very short phrase, he went away. Where'd he go? Well, he he's comfortable being with people, but also he needs his solitude and silence. So I think about that up here at the monastery where I live, and we seek solitude and silence, but also we're what's called cenobitic community. We live in community. So at times we're with one another, and at times we have public worship. That is, people come to mass here, especially on Sunday, and you talk to them afterwards. And some of the guys are pretty friendly with the townies, as I sometimes call them, the neighborhood folk, and so on. So but they wouldn't want to spend all day with them, and the townies probably wouldn't want to spend all day with us. So, but there is that sense of the balance, as opposed to the monks who live at Big Sur. They're not Trappists. They don't live cenobitically. They don't live in community. They live separate. They come together, I think, once a week for a meal. They do come together for liturgy, I believe. But I don't believe they come together in choir. They seek a lot of silence and solitude. That's what they feel is their call. And so I think Jesus just continues to show that to us. But you don't write about it because what do you write about? They said, well, he went out in the desert by himself alone at night. What else can you say? Um, but he knew that there was more than just work. And when he took those disciples, the three of them, up on the mountain, the big hill, and he was transfigured before them, he knew that this event was going to happen. Otherwise, why would he taken him up there? So he'd probably been up on mountaintops before by himself and experienced these transfigured moments in which he was very much in contact with the divine and in this transfiguration moment, it was Elijah and Moses, but it's very much a sense that there was of all that he is, and that can suddenly be exposed or shown in the transfigured moment, the light that he showed to his disciples. Why? So that when they saw him on the cross, which they didn't, they ran away, but they remember that he was crucified and looked pretty bad, looked like an executed criminal. He wasn't executed, and he was considered a criminal. They would remember that there was more. They wouldn't abandon him. And then, of course, the resurrection showed that. So Jesus is very much in touch in those 30 years of the hidden life, as they say, with his fullness and with just enjoying being a human being. So we are made in the image and likeness of God, and we're supposed to be transformed into the Christ. So I hope that our spiritual journey is one in which we can enjoy being a human being with, our wounds and injuries and aging and whatever happens, that we can just enjoy being a human being while we are a human being on this earth. And do the best we can, I guess, nowadays to make it a good place for people who follow us so that they can enjoy being human beings. Last Saturday when I taught, I looked outside, I felt like I was on Mars, whatever Mars might look like. I mean, the sun was out, but you could hardly see it. You could look straight at it. It was so dim and it was so shadowy. There were no shadows because the sun couldn't make shadows. It was just so much smoke. So I guess we really need to kind of clean up our act a little bit. Well, keep in mind now that Berdiaev, he lived at a time when you've got the Industrial Revolution. You've got, nation building is happening, okay? The 19th century, we're really building nations. And because they don't like one another, but we're building nations. And we're beginning to move from the feudal society to these industrial giants, and people are working less and less on the land, and more they're being abused in the long hours in smelly, dirty factories. This is the beginning of our pollution, if you'd say. And Nikolai is looking at all this, and he sees that we're not allowed to develop our full sense of we're not allowed to enjoy being human, and we're not allowed to enjoy a full sense of spirituality. We're just so driven to survive. Uh, and then he sees this. He sees the solutions to survival is capitalism on one hand, which he sees as abused workers, and he sees it in Russia as the peasants, most of whom are working the land for the few rich people. He says that's not too good a deal either. And then communism, which is considered a solution. And he says, no, you're not allowed to develop your individuality there either. So he's looking at all this, and what he says, he's looking at various systems from a sense of spirituality, a sense of our humanness is supposed to interconnect so that all of us can become more fully human and therefore come to ascertain, discover, and enjoy our full Christness, if you will, divinity. So he finds that capitalism really enslaves us because to him, his experience, yours may be different, but his experience is he finds it all about power and money. And so we talk about it ourselves. He says, well, it's the best system because it creates wealth for everyone. And that may be true, but it wasn't his experience. It was creating wealth for a few people. I mean, all those peasants who are working on the Russian land, it was a very agrarian society. They were not benefiting as fully as the owners. And the owners weren't doing anything. And the peasants were doing all the work, but not getting that much of the produce. And Tolstoy saw this. Tolstoy was a landowner, I believe, and it bothered him. And he actually started doing some of the work himself. And I'm sure this was in some of his writings as well. So the experience is that economics, so we don't bash capitalism or socialism, economic solutions do not do enough to help the individual develop their spiritual life, because they're not about a spiritual life, apparently. And we are about a spiritual life. It doesn't help us to develop more fully who we are as individuals. Non-duality relationship with God and with one another. It's more competitive in one sense. So the sense is that money is what will confer upon us a sense of individuality, a sense of independence. But as I started out, you need a certain sense of independence when you're growing up to have a sense of separate self, become who you are. You don't become your mother or your father, you become you. God made you to be you, not your best friend or not the group that you associate with, but you. But here, it's moved into independence. Money makes you independent. It also makes you very separate from others. And especially if money becomes the focus, then you're less and less concerned about others, because if you're really concerned about others, you're not going to be so worried about getting all you can for yourself. So there's more of an ego separation instead of a sense of individuality that connects. And what he's looking for is an individuality that connects. That's the personality, as he says. That's the best kind of individual have. You are becoming more fully yourself, but yet in connection with God, be it the feminine or the masculine, or it should be both, and with one another. But what's happening now, more and more people are coming into the world, and there's famine and so on, as there's always been, and some plagues still, uh, that people become material dependent on others or they starve. And in other words, the government isn't going to take care of you. It didn't. It didn't in Russia. Well, what would happen is when there was a famine, the Tsar had barns, sort of government barns, government bins full of grain that they could hand out. Uh, so you were materially dependent. You were dependent upon somebody else. You were no longer, even if you were a farmer, you were still dependent upon somebody else, or you would starve. So it became very competitive, I think. And when you get so worried about just your next meal, uh, sometimes it can be a little bit hard to develop a spiritual life. You get kind of anxious. And Jesus, on the other hand, was an independent contractor, if you will. So he didn't work for somebody else. He was, let's say, he was a carpenter. He didn't work for a carpenter factory owned by somebody else. They didn't have those then. He was a carpenter. He made a deal for furniture. He made the furniture. He delivered it. You paid him. But you didn't have that. You were running out of that. You didn't have these little independent businesses. You had big business. So he looks at, he says sometimes it's almost like slavery. And remember, slavery was still around early on in his life. I mean, it ended with 1865 in the United States. But he says that sometimes slavery is easier than it is to be independent in our society because you can be passive. You can just wait till somebody else takes care of you. Yes, you don't have freedom, but you have a place to live and you'll be fed. So, in some senses, the Russian peasant was free, but really wasn't free. And so, if you're always working to survive, and in factories, they were very long hours, which is why unions were starting to develop, but we're not about that here. But what we are about is that they were very long hours, and you get very tired, and you start saying, well, who has the time to meditate? Remember, what I think what Benedict is saying is, why can't we have economies and lifestyle that permits, and we have the energy for meditation? I mean, up here in the monastery, we're supposed to be about prayer, study, and work, but we don't work all day long. And we get up early in the morning, and we go to bed early at night, but we're not worried right now about starving, and we're in a drought. So I think of St. Benedict, who founded this whole monastic movement in the West in the 500s. What is St. Benedict trying to do? He's trying to develop an economy so that they can do what they want to do, and they all want to meditate. They all want to develop a sense of non-duality. They all want to get back to that feminine God of oneness, of unity, of love. So that's why he developed it. Because and that's why the monks went out into the desert in the 300s and 400s after Jesus. They went out in the desert because they saw that religion and economy, the economy of the Roman Empire, was not conducive to meditation and to developing the Christianity of love that they thought was what Jesus was all about. And so they hightailed it into the hills. They went away, as it said in today's scripture, after Jesus visited with the children. He went away. So, what we're looking for is the kind of life in which we can survive economically and meditate. We can go away and do our meditation on a daily basis because, as Berdeyev and all these mystics believe, you're not going to really become fully yourself unless you can have a little bit of time for silence and solitude, however you do that. Now, it doesn't mean you have to sit with your eyes closed. You could paint pictures. You could be a painter. You could draw. You could be a poet. But however that comes about, there's probably a certain amount of time in which you're just comfortably in your own skin. And I think that's a more meditative way of life. So this is what Berdeyev has seen. It's not happening. So he does talk a lot about power and who has the power. Now, uh, what happens, I think, is, and one of the things I do want to talk about today is our idea of the God of power. I've been sort of getting on the edges of it. That idea of God of power, I think, comes from that male image of God. Um, like Zeus. If you were to read the Hebrew scriptures and read it, if you could, I mean, a little bit of study, read it chronologically. That is, when was it written, as opposed to reading it sequentially in the Bible? Because just because it's sequential in the Bible doesn't mean it's chronological. But if you read it chronologically, and I guess a good study guide, a good study Bible would tell you when they think it was written. What you will see, first of all, is first that there's many gods. Well, that comes from the Greek system, and Zeus is the best and the biggest. And you don't you don't you don't mess with Zeus, and you don't get too close to Zeus. but but you mess around with Zeus, and Zeus is going to zap you badly. I think it was Prometheus. Uh, Zeus had the fire, and Zeus wasn't going to share fire. It was very valuable. Zeus is a jealous God, a little bit of selfish God too. So Prometheus steals the fire and brings it to the human being. Prometheus, trying to be a nice guy, brings it to the earth, to humanity. So now we have fire, we have warmth, we have light at night. We can cook. Zeus is really upset. So he ties Prometheus to a rock on the top of a mountain. And remember, these gods are immortal. And then every day, and I think it's an eagle, some bird appears and eats Prometheus's liver. And that's painful. And then overnight, the liver grows back, eagle comes again, and that was it for Prometheus. You mess with Zeus, you're going to get zapped. And that's a lot of what the early scriptures were. You do what the mighty God wants you to do, or you're going to get it. And so, and God is, and the Hebrew God is just one of many gods. But as it moves on, it becomes kind of the only God. But it's still kind of the mighty God. And then you start getting into scriptures like Song of Songs, wisdom literature, written much later, in which they begin to develop a sense of non-duality, of being one with, of really goddesses of love. And then you get Jesus, who, when he goes public, he says, God is love. What are you guys doing with this power God? But I see it all the time now. That people are praying to God who's far away. Hey, God, I'm going to do good things. So please show up. And here's my list of things that I want to make me feel better or to make my friend feel better, which will make me feel better, or my neighbor or my relative, and so on and so forth. Not that that's a bad thing, but that's kind of the relationship. And a lot of people get involved in what they would call spirituality. And I would call it kind of religion without much depth. God is Zeus, got all the power and give you stuff. if you make a good deal. And Jesus comes along and says, he says, you know what? I think God's love. And not only is God love, but God says, why don't you surrender yourself completely to me? Well, I don't think so. Is no. We're busy in this world getting the things that we want. We're not going to surrender everything to God. I mean, even in the monastery, we're supposed to surrender. It's a hard thing to do. It goes against that that desire to grow up and be an individual. And yet it's necessary for us to be knowing we need the mother God. We need to be close to the breast, if you will. And I think sometimes that's the reason when adult men are making love to a woman, they a lot of them, they just go to the breast. There's something about, we have an instinct for that kind of early sense of non-duality. We're doing the best we can. Oh, maybe we're not. But Berdayev is saying it's just not working. Economically, is this not the solution? He thinks that love is the path to the fullness of what he calls personality. Labor should be a part of it, but you should not be abused. You are a human being. You are not a labor thing, just part of the making of a product that can be sold so the owner can make tons of money and you get just enough to survive. So he says love. So can't we have a society that has love? Well, I think that's the things that the spiritual traditions are really all about. Love is the path. And what we want to do is try to find a way to have that happen. So he says love can be rapture. Teresa of Avila, for instance, it can be rapture. You can have it in your meditation, but it's not everything. It is a sense of non-duality, but then you need to get out of your rapture and be of service, which means love can also be sympathy for others. Now think of an economic system that's sympathetic. And he says also it can be compassionate. Think of an economic system that's compassionate. Think of it. Well, instead of economic system, think of yourself, since we're trying to grow as persons, that part of our sense of union with God is to be compassionate, sympathetic to the sufferings of others. And Berdayev kind of ups it, but Jesus has really said this. He lived his life this way. He said, compassionate love has no need of mutuality. Unpack that a little bit. It says, I act lovingly to you without expecting anything from you. Now, people in recovery programs know this. And Jesus lived it this way. Compassionate love. And people didn't pay him back with compassionate love. He was compassionate to people, and some of them said, crucify him, crucify him. And notice, I'll go back to that feminine instinct. As Jesus was out in his public ministry, his mother wanted to come see him, and he said, who is my mother? Who are my brothers and sisters? He says, the ones who do the will. There were times when he wondered, and his mother thought he was crazy. It said the scripture, well, his family thought he was insane. So they're all trying to figure it out too. But so Jesus gives you this sense of independence that he has in his public ministry. But notice when he's on the cross, he's thinking about his mother, and she's right there with him. She didn't abandon him, even if she thought he was crazy. She doesn't abandon him. I mean, Mary, tomorrow, by the way, is the Feast of the Assumption tomorrow in my tradition. uh, Mary didn't give up on her son. And God, God the Mother, doesn't give up on us, even if, whatever. And of course, Jesus was becoming more fully who he is, but Mary didn't quite get that at that moment. She never was giving up on him. She was fully invested in what he was doing. And even though it perplexed her, isn't that the human condition? God working in us. But then he says, which in John's gospel, I think it is, he says, behold your mother, behold your son. I want to make sure that my mother is taken care of. I recognize that she's here with me. And one of the best things that you can do for someone is be with them when they're suffering so they don't feel so alone in their pain. And that's exactly, in other words, Mary does what she can do. And I think God, the mother image, does what God can do. Well, we're doing what we do. So Jesus showed that he will love you even if you don't love in return. That's the way it was with his disciples. And that seems to be the way he is with everybody. So the world is seems to be an evil place. This is early 20th century. So a lot of misery. The world is evil, but not because it's the world of matter, of things. But he says because it's enslaved. We're enslaved to power, to money, to control, the great industrial revolution. And at least that was his view. He just sees a lot of people enslaved, and their religion is praying to God, to the Zeus God, if you will, to alleviate some of their suffering because they can't figure out how to do it. And it was a time when there was not a great emphasis on contemplative practice in the Western tradition, which is why I think in the mid 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution is rolling along, say the mid and latter 19th century, what's coming along is wisdom figures from Hinduism and Buddhism, probably Sufis for all I know, and they're coming to the West. They're coming to the United States. Sadhu Singh, he's one I talk about, Sandor Sadhu Singh. And people are saying, what's the guy talking about? Because all Westerners do is going to church, reading the Bible. It's not that that's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all. It's a good thing. But it's not going to fully develop that Christ center that's in you. You need a bit of a contemplative, you need a meditative life. And so these guys are talking about meditation. And some of them talking about stop paying attention to your thoughts. Stop paying attention to all the stuff's going on in your mind and stop talking. And how about sitting quietly and in silence and stillness? And people say, what, are you kidding me? Plus, we're too busy for that. And they're saying, busyness is not going to fulfill you. So, I mean, there was one Trappist monastery in the entire United States in the 19th century. I mean, it was in Kentucky. So it wasn't as if we were making a big input into all this. And the Paul's Fathers were only founded in 1858, and we were not contemplative, let me tell you that. So he didn't have a lot. But Berdayev knew it. He knew about it. He came from the more Orthodox tradition, and somehow he just knew about this, and he knew that we had it. But he was more encouraging people. That is, encouraging us by saying, here's what you can have, as opposed to saying exactly how you get it. And I think that's what a lot of the saints do in our traditions, saints, mystics, holy people that we follow, is they don't tell you exactly how they pray, but they show you by their way of life what you can have. And what the gurus were doing coming from the East were kind of giving you a methodology. And we had a methodology in the West, but we had dropped it. because we got involved in the Reformation and we all started living out of our head. I mean, what did Descartes say? And he was a Christian. He says, I think, therefore I am. I am because I'm up in my head. Well, that was great for science and mathematics and calculus and engineering and the Industrial Revolution and inventions, but it wasn't great for developing a spiritual life. And he was a Christian, but who was teaching him about contemplation? So the world's not evil because it's the world of matter and things. It's because we're of the way we live in it, and we're seeing this now in our ecology. So he goes on to say this: being is an idea. He says it's an idea of the universal. He didn't like it. He doesn't like to talk like. He doesn't like to talk. He wants to get to the universal. He wants to get to the sense of non-duality through a sense of your mature individuality. That's how he wants to go there. And you're not going to have a sense of a mature individuality if you're part of the mass laboring culture working in a factory as just a thing with no other value than an economic thing. So he doesn't want you, he says, if you start looking at you're part of the universal, he thinks is that you're partial. Universal is whole, and you're a part of, so you're partial. And that's not what non-duality is not about being partial. And being one with everyone is not about being part of everyone. It's about being you, your unique, beautiful, human created self in a loving, compassionate, sympathetic relationship with all around you, so that people are not so much strangers. That means you don't know them socially, but you kind of know them as being filled with the divine. Yeah, we sometimes get the idea that, okay, you've got Christ in you and I got Christ in me. You got a little bit of Christ and I got a little bit of Christ. So we're all part of the big Christ. And that's not going to do it either. That's not the contemplative life. We've all got the fullness. Christ isn't parts. God's not parts divided up into 8 billion people. God's not parts. God is whole. So God is whole in each one of us. God is not spatial. All right. So you can't get out of that way of thinking, spatial thinking, unless you can get into a more contemplative way of silence and solitude and let go of your thinking, that's how it is, all mathematic. And suddenly, inspired, enlightened, or whatever, or maybe gradually, you'll get the sense that I am the fullness of Christ in the world, and so is everybody else. And you begin to not only enjoy it in you, but try to live it that way with others. So don't think of yourself as here's the universal and you're a part of it. That your true self or God truly living in you is very singular. You might say existential. You're unique. God has made you for a particular job, if you will. But you're unique and yet in a non-dual relationship with everybody else. And that is not going to come to you by trying to think it out. You can't think your way to being separate and complete with everybody else. It doesn't happen that way. You don't think your way to it. I think, therefore I am. Thank you, Descartes, but that's certainly not what makes a full human being. So he doesn't like this Zeus God who's always doing stuff. God always does. And that's what a lot of us believe. I mean, if you ask somebody, what is God doing? Oh, why doesn't God fix the world? Because God's a doing God. No, why does God fix what God made it? Why didn't God fix it? Because we think like Descartes. God's got God's hands in everything and is doing this and doing that. God's busy, busy, busy creating the world because we can only think sequentially, and especially in the Industrial Revolution, think in terms of making things. God's making things. But then God's always doing. It's kind of, you've predetermined who God is and what God does or is supposed to do. So God has no freedom. God, you made the world. It's screwed up. Why don't you fix it? And if you don't, I'm out of here. And think if you did that with another human being, they would have no freedom. So God doesn't have, we don't allow God to be free just to be God. God's got to be fixing things. And you don't allow yourself to discover God is God because you're living up in your head and you think of God as a thing, an individual who does stuff because that's the way you know individuals. They do stuff. And if you don't do stuff, well, you should starve. So God is free to be God. And God is not in charge of fixing the universe as far as I'm concerned. I think if God's going to fix the universe, I'm conjecturing God will fix it through me and you. So here's a way to look. There's no such thing as a general human being. He says there's no such thing as a horse. There's individual horses, but horse. So he said, horse looks like this. He says, no, whatever you think a horse looks like an individual horse that you saw once. So there's no individual, there's no such thing as man or woman, or transgender, bisexual, gay, lesbian. There's no such thing as just this general. We're all unique individuals. And God, he believes that God made individuals. And we need to become these individuals, our fullest self. He doesn't think God created a world order, that God's in charge of fixing. He said he created individuals, and individuals can mess up. But if we have a contemplative life, we're likely not to mess up. And it seems that a lot of the mystical figures are in touch with the beauty of nature and the need to preserve it because they have a sense of the divine in things, not up in the sky. So the medieval church, we got a few minutes here. Vatican II. Now, he wasn't around for Vatican II, but it focused on conscience and says, in other words, instead of telling people what they're supposed to think and do, which is kind of a religion that doesn't really trust us, that thinks human beings are so full of sin and degradation that they can't figure it out, and we got to tell them what to do, which means from on high, you're told how to live your life and how you're supposed to be. And from on high gets very suspicious of anybody who doesn't fit in to some commonality. That Berdeev is against. And Vatican II says the individual conscience needs to be considered. And nowadays, the individual conscience still needs to be considered, but it needs to be an informed conscience. So with all the kinds of news that is coming out now, you have to be careful. Are you an informed individual, or are you just listening to people who already agree with your prejudices and your anxieties and your fears and your lack of growing up, which would, of course, be problematic. I think in terms of something that is called a common good. It's very much part of my Catholic tradition, the common good. Uh, and I think the Jesuits taught it as well. And I went to Fordham, the Jesuit college. Um, the common good. What am I doing? And how does it affect other people? Well, you could think of the industrial baron or the czar of Russia, in Berdyaev's case. Did they were what am I doing and how does it affect others? They probably didn't think much about that unless there was a famine, and then they said, "Well, I guess I better do something. Things aren't working out." But otherwise, they live their pompous lives, and other people barely get along. So we have to keep that in mind nowadays to say what is my action doing to everybody else, and I think the uh, just that Jesus had a sense of that. I believe saying what I'm doing, how is it affecting everybody else? So he knew that what he was doing was bothering some religious officials who thought that people should do what they're told and were not too much involved in developing a full self. They just lived by rules and regulations. And Jesus said, we weren't made for rules and regulations. They were made to help us. And if they don't help us, so I think that he said, what would my crucifixion do? Well, as he was learning it going along, you have to be yourself. You may pay a price, but you have to be who you are. And he fought it some in the Garden of Gethsemane, but ultimately it was a complete letting go. And when he completely let go, my God, why have you forsaken me on the cross? And then it says, into your hands I commend my spirit. I'm all in. I'm giving it all to you. So you can see as we come to the end of this morning, you can see the development from the mother, non-duality, the Father God, individuality, then holding the two together, and then the cross, fully giving it over, uh, fully dependent upon. And it was all, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, but it also had a lot of the feminine in it as well. And that, I think, is the ultimate that we go to. And that's what the contemplative will do. A separate individuality, a separate individual's personality, fully developed, will be one who surrenders themselves completely to the divine will. So, a couple of more minutes, and we will stop. The medieval church, which was what Berdyaev knew, it focused pretty much on abstract principles that would apply in all cases. So it's very much we would consider the masses, if you would. And the medieval church from on high had abstract principles that applied in every single case. There was no sense of individual cases. So we have had a history of trying to run religion without individuals, in which, so there was humankind, there was a general man or general woman, and all these principles applied to every one of them equally. And people like Berdyaev says, no, we're individuals, and you can't have abstract principles that apply in all cases. But you can see how a medieval church would so fit in for the Industrial Revolution. And I mean, my tradition fought against it with Leo XIII, the Pope in the 1890s, said that people have a right to unions. That's an aside. But the medieval church, so a corporation, those things that were really formed in the 19th century, corporations, when they ran their businesses, everybody was the same. You were all abstract. It was all workers, not an individual worker. They were laborers, not individual laborers. You were never considered an individual. So we're trying to have a spirituality that says you're individuals, but you can live in community if you have love and compassion. So we're going to take a break now. It's about 5 to 10 Mountain Time, almost lunch for Mary back there in Knoxville. So we'll take a little break. We got up to 19 people. Wow. And we'll take a little bit, 10 minutes, right, Chris?
And we'll be back at 10:05.
Yeah. And then I'm going to recommend a book to you at 10:05. Okay.
And it's 10:05 and we are back. If anybody have any questions, please put it in chat and Father Terry will read those, or unmute yourself and ask Father Terry directly.
Well, welcome back to each of you. And as you may be thinking up something, I'm going to continue on with a couple of things that has very much to do with this power thing with God. It's us who creates our image of God. So the will to power, that is wanting power, is not a property of God. And Benedict brings this up. It's organized religion, I think, that does it, but it's really our creation of God to mirror us who want power. In other words, we're making God in our image and likeness, saying, if I were God, would I die on a cross? You bet I would not. I would not. Would I come into a world with no indoor plumbing? No. No electricity? No heat? No. So we're making this whole sense of power is what we want, and part of it is because we don't have it. We don't have enough of it. In the contemplative dimension of the gospel of the life, we realize we do have power. It's the power to become who God made us to be, and to surrender ourselves to God way down the road, not too early. So, but it's our creation of God, power, to mirror us who want power. Jesus, for instance, for those of you who are Christian, God liberates, does not dominate. It's not about you have to do this, you have to do that. Jesus said, simply follow me. Look at what I do. See if you can get it. And one of the things he did was go out into the desert and do nothing, seemingly nothing. And his disciples didn't came out to the desert to get him. They said, hey, everybody wants you to do things. Come on, people are looking for you. Be active. Make the world a better place. That is better for you and me. But God is liberating us, freeing us from this enslavement to power. God suffers. Yeah. I remember as a little boy, I'd got up into heaven pretty comfortable with indoor plumbing, electricity, and heat, and indoor toilets. Whereas Jesus was down here on earth getting crucified. That's two gods. That's not our faith. So God suffered, and God is crucified, loving us. Put that into your spiritual life. That'll take a lot of meditation to get there. So, as Benedict says, and I've been saying this, we don't have a right to power. We have an obligation to become empowered to make the world a better place. All these people saying, I have a right to do whatever I darn well please. No, you don't. The common good is not part of doing whatever you please. And if you don't have a contemplative life, whatever you please is selfish, self-centered, and it's all about you. And that's not going to make the world a better place by any means. And it's probably not even going to make you a better person. So Benedict puts it this way. There is not a right to power, but rather an obligation to power, to become empowered as a full human being, because then you'll be compassionate and treating individuals as the body of Christ, if you will. He says, you have an obligation to power as an organic function. In other words, as non-duality, for the protection of all human beings, not for the exploitation of all human beings, so you can live with all your wealth. So fear disfigures power. So the state, he'll look at looks at communism, that state, looks at nationalism, those states. They have power, but they fear one another. Or because there's fear, that is, let me put it this way, the state doesn't have a contemplative dimension. The state is this organism of people that are not individuals, not really, not in nation building. So when you have this kind of state that has power, fear comes with it, and they find enemies. And then they kind of hate one another. And in the 20th century, you've had several wars. And he's awfully suspicious of people who want to create a better and happier world. He says they're the cause of much suffering. Communism would be an example. I'm sure Marx thought it was going to be a better world, but he hadn't met Stalin, and there was a lot of people died when Lenin was in with power too. So it's atheistic, and in many ways the West is atheistic because we have organized religion, but we don't have a contemplative dimension of our religion that allows us to develop as full human beings. So the idea, people get into power, they get power hungry. They want to, and they say, "Oh no, I want to create a better, happier world." Says, no, there's much suffering when you try to create a better, happier, because we're individuals. When you try to create a better, happier world, you people who want power but without contemplation, you consider everybody just people. They're not individuals. They're generic humans. He says world harmony is really an enslaving idea. You can't create world harmony. You've got individuals with a spiritual life. They will form unions. I don't mean labor unions, or maybe, but they'll form community based upon a spiritual dimension. So people need a certain creative freedom. If they have a contemplative life, their freedom, they will be creative, and that freedom to be creative will be for the good of others. But it doesn't make everybody the same. It kind of, it nixes unity. If you're going to have creative freedom, not everybody's going to be the same. And you see that in reformers. You see that Teresa of Avila, she took creative freedom. She didn't wait for it to be given to her. And that next unity in the Carmelites, it separated them out, discalced from the non-discalced, and so on and so forth. All these reformers taking on creative freedom are going with something and said, you want to be part of it, be part of it. So the sense of it all, he says, that's an abstract thought. I think, therefore, I am. He says, that's just an abstract thought. He says, accidents happen. It's part of the universe. It's part of the way the world is, part of the universe. Stuff happens. We often say stuff happens. It's not as if everything is supposed to happen a certain way. Things can just happen. So let's just keep all that in mind. Now, I am finished, unless somebody wants to ask a question. Oh, a book. Here's a book called, look at how thin this book is. This book is 106 pages long, and it's really not even that because it starts on page 7. It's written by a fellow named Cyprian Consiglio, nice Italian boy. He happens to be the abbot of Big Sur in California, the monastery up there. And they are monks. They're not Trappists, but they are monks who live separately for the sake of, not big on community. They're not big on guests. They don't have retreat facilities, and they're not big on work. I should have joined them. Any case, he writes, The God Who Gave You Birth, A Spirituality of Kenosis, and put up by Liturgical Press. We're going to have this in our bookstore very soon. So keep that in mind, those of you who live in the Roaring Fork Valley up near us. And I have found this very helpful. as I'm looking through it. So that's a book to recommend. We're going to have it in our bookstore very soon. The God Who Gave You Birth, August 23rd, which is very soon now. We will again get together to continue this theme on power, individuality, becoming fully who we are, and so on and so forth, and the contemplative journey in 2 weeks, 2 Saturdays from now at 9 o'clock Mountain Time. So I thank you all for tuning in. Mary Cattle, this book I think is good for SOS. It's a short book. That'd be a good one for discussion. It's a lot in here.
Yeah, I'll pass that on to us.
Yeah, pass that on to them. Okay, we'll see you all later. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. The recording will be available from today, probably in the next couple hours on our snowmassbookstore.com and your YouTube channel. So check that out. We'll see you in a couple weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Father.